Well, thank you. Good morning. I've been in the veterans advocacy business for about 13 years now. I started out with the employment department as an employment representative, working with those who were returning to Oregon to get a job, just recently getting out of the military. Went from there, worked with the Oregon Department of Veterans Affairs as a veterans advocate, and worked with a wide generation of veterans from all the way as old as World War I, all the way up through our current conflicts. So I have a wide range of working with individuals with different types of backgrounds, both physical and mental health issues. And so some of the things I bring to the table are from that experience. And then in addition, there's a lot of research that I've done over the years on what is post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury and that type of thing. So I'm going to offer some of that resource and research information today. So the first thing I want to ask is, I always ask this question of people because I'm always interested to hear what people have to say, right? We come at it from different approaches. When I say student veteran, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Someone who served actively in the military, potentially older than average, yep. Highly disciplined, yes. Could be currently active or serving, right? Experience with diverse population, yes. Could be a man or a woman. How about dependents? Do you think that they could be considered student veterans? Sure. The VA offers VA benefits to dependents as well. We talked about active duty, and I put on the tag of currently serving, so that includes our National Guard reserves, right? How about our OTC cadets? I will tell you, Oregon State University is unique, and I cherish this, and I know my student veterans cherish this as well, and the advisory committee and the work group are standing behind this too, is that we actually acknowledge our ROTC cadets as part of our student veteran population. Part of the reason we do that is because there are veterans, those who've served in the military, that are within that population. But the other thing is, this is the future of tomorrow. They are going to become active duty military or National Guard Reserve military people. They are going to become veterans. So why not have them connected with the individuals who've already served, so that way they can get some leadership and mentorship and whatnot from those individuals as well. The cadre, ROTC cadre, already adhere and understand that concept, and that's how they do it with their cadets. But also have them exposed to student veterans is a good thing. So what I'm going to do now is show you a video that was shot by student veterans for student veterans and staff. So that way you can hear directly from student veterans what is their experience and what do they view when they come back. This is about a 4.5-minute video. So as you heard from these students across the nation, that it talks about some of the comments that we said here. You notice that they're a little bit older than traditional students. Some of them talked about their wide range of experience, right? And some of them talk about the transition back to school and back to civilian life, some of the things that they've had to do. One of the things I like about this video is even though it doesn't talk specifically or directly to it, you can see that they do what they can to tie into the school to even do part of that transition. There's cross-country club, there's the individual who does the mountain biking, and then the individual who talks about their experience at the school and how positive it is when they're around other students. So it's clear that student veterans want to come back to school to get their education, to make that next step. But there are some challenges, right, when they do the transition. Some setups are very difficult for them to try to navigate, or there might be environment. So the one of the things I want to talk a little bit about is some of the misconceptions or myths, and here are some of them. One of the things I hear a lot is that all veterans must have served in combat. I go to different places and I have people who walk up to me and go, well, that person's not a veteran, they didn't serve in combat. Well, that's not true. I'm a veteran and I never served in combat. I served 6 years in the military and I was trained to go to combat at any time my unit wanted to take me, but I wasn't in during a time when there was combat. I was in during a time when we were essentially, even though it's still considered a war era, I was in during a time where there was essentially, peace. We weren't really actually doing anything. We weren't in Iraq and Afghanistan at the time. We had just come out of the Persian Gulf with the first Iraq War. We had Bosnia and Somalia, but I did not get those opportunities to go to those places. The other thing is all combats have, veterans must have PTSD, and that's not true. There are a lot of combat veterans that go 1, 2, 3, 4 times. They come home, and they're able to adapt. I would say somebody who's went multiple times maybe is just working through it, but I've met several people that that have seen some stuff and they're fine. You know, they have learned how to take it to that next step and how to deal with it. You know, the big one is only combat veterans have PTSD. That's not necessarily the case either. You know, or veterans with PTSD are dangerous. It's interesting because how many people have read a media article recently about a veteran who has committed a crime? Now, those of you who've read that article, somewhere in that article, isn't there some reference to PTSD? Whether that person has it or not, right? Especially if that person's a combat veteran. So, if you were reading those all the time, what would be your thought pattern, right? And then you come to find out and you do the research on the veteran and they were a stateside clerk, or they were a person who was in the Navy for 2 years in the reserves or something like that. Saw no combat, nothing like that. That has nothing to do with the crime that they committed. Now, does that mean that there aren't situations where PTSD and combat veterans relate to the crime? Yeah, there's those things too, but I just find sometimes that that's where we naturally go. What's interesting about some of these myths is that there might be some truth in some of them, but it's not consistent for all of them. You know, for instance, the one about carrying a weapon, I will tell you that I personally have no problem with guns, but I'm not one to carry one. And I know a lot of combat veterans that have no problem with guns, but they're not one to carry one. They don't feel they need to. And then there's others that are quite the opposite. Service members aren't always deployed to combat areas. They may also be deployed on foreign and domestic humanitarian missions. The Navy, that's a big one. They aren't always deployed to a combat area, but how many people knew that we sent an aircraft carrier off the coast of Haiti when the big earthquake happened? Did the same thing when Japan happened, the earthquake there. Our aircraft carrier, you know, especially the great big ones that are nuclear powered, I mean, they can do a lot of damage, but they can do a lot of help. I mean, we're talking full service hospitals, surgery rooms, kitchens, you know, water, septic kind of tanks that take seawater into fresh water in a matter of hours. But in the same token, those individuals that went to those places, do you think they saw things, witnessed things, were challenged by things that they still carry today? Sure, but they weren't deployed to combat. This is from the Department of VA's National Center of PTSD. And here it is. So post-traumatic stress disorder can occur after you have been through a trauma. A trauma is something horrible and scary that you see or that happens to you. During this type of event, you think that your life or others' lives are in danger. You may feel afraid or think you have no control over what is happening. Going through trauma is not rare, though. About 60% of men and 50% of women experience at least one trauma in their lives. Women are more likely to experience sexual assault and child sexual abuse, and men are more likely to experience accidents, physical assault, combat, disaster, or to witness death or injury. Now I want you to note that I put in here about 60% of men and 50% of women, okay? When we get to the stats down below of what suffers PTSD, you'll find something interesting. Going through a trauma doesn't mean you'll get PTSD, though. Although over half of us go through some type of trauma, a much smaller percent develop PTSD. About 7 to 8% of the population, general population, will have PTSD at some point in their lives. Okay, about 5.2 million adults have PTSD during a given year. This is only a small portion of those who have gone through a trauma. So we're talking 60 to 50%, 60% of men across the population, whether you're military or not, and 50% of women suffer a traumatic event in their lives, right? But only 7 to 8% of the general population have an element of PTSD. So that's a big note to note. Women are more likely than men to develop PTSD, though. About 10% of women develop PTSD sometime in their life compared with the 5% of men. So even though women have a tendency of seeing less traumatic event because they have a higher tendency of developing PTSD is what the study has found out. Now, if you are in the military, you may have seen combat. You may have also been on missions that exposed you to horrible and life-threatening experiences. Remember we talked about? Okay. You may have been shot at, seen a bunny shot, or seen death. These are types of events that can lead to PTSD. As a matter of fact, over 90% of returning veterans have experienced a traumatic event in their lifetime. So, and that's not just combat. That's what a lot of people forget is it's not just combat. We have accidents, grueling accidents that happen depending on what MOS you're in, military occupation you're in. The experts think that PTSD occurs in about 11 to 20% of veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So this is our most recent ones, Operation Iraqi and Enduring Freedom. Or to give you in 11 to 20 veterans out of 100, right? In as many as 10% of Gulf War, Desert Storm veterans, or 10 out of 100. But here's what's interesting. In about 30% of Vietnam veterans, or 30 out of 100 Vietnam veterans, actually suffer PTSD. So what's interesting is that we have this myth out there that says all veterans must have been in combat, and all combat veterans must have PTSD, but the research says differently, right? Now let's talk about what is PTSD and some of the triggers for post-traumatic stress disorder. So, what are some things that you think would trigger post-traumatic stress disorder? Confined spaces, loud noises, being touched, large groups of people, so environmental stimuli that are similar to the traumatic event, stress, bridges and overpasses. So a lot of our senses, right? What we see, what we hear. How about smell? One individual from Vietnam was a diesel mechanic, and he couldn't understand why anytime he got around diesel fuel, he would start having memories of Vietnam. And as he went through counseling, he had blocked out a time in his life where he was on a convoy, and almost all of the people on the convoy, with the exception of him and about 3 other people, were wiped out, were eliminated. And so we're talking, there was about 20 different individuals on the convoy, and they were riding in diesel trucks. They were in the back of a deuce and a half. But for years, never could. He just blocked it out because he was injured in the process too, so he didn't remember a lot of the things that happened. But whenever he was around diesel trucks, it would just trigger him. Not too long after 9/11 happened, we started seeing more Vietnam veterans come in our office. It was all that news media that was out there, all those pictures of what was happening. And they were now coming to realization, wait a minute, that used to be us just 30, 40, 50 years ago. And now they were seeking benefits. We heard that a lot from our Vietnam veterans in particular. The Vietnamese and a lot of Vietnam veterans had a problem with places like Chinatown and some of those other places. What's interesting in this generation of Iraqi Afghanistan veterans is there was a lot of us that speculated that that type of thing would be the way as well, because when you looked back at World War II and the fact that the World War II veterans were really big or anti-Japanese and anti-German, and then you look at the Korean War veterans that were kind of anti-Korean, and on into Vietnam. But it's interesting, in this generation, there's a lot less of that. There still is some, but there's a lot less of it than in the previous generations. And I think that's because in the previous generations, there wasn't as much of a humanitarian effort that was done a lot of times in those wars. They went through, they did their battles, they went to the next city. They went through, they did their battles, they went to the next city. I mean, in this generation of combat, you have soldiers that are blowing up a bridge, and then the next week they're turning around and working with the local community after they've cleared out the insurgents and enemy to rebuild that bridge. What are some other things that you think would trigger PTSD? Drugs and alcohol? Okay. So those are some things, some environmental choices that they make, by getting, taking on too much, getting tired maybe, or just having a long day, or if they're choosing to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, that type of thing. Has anybody ever dealt with somebody who has talked about having recurring dreams, nightmares? Yeah. That's pretty common amongst somebody who is maybe suffering PTSD at that time. As a matter of fact, in the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Health Conditions, under Criterion B, they talk about intrusive recollection. The traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in at least one of the following ways: recurrent and intrusive distressing recollection of the event, including images, thoughts, or perception. Recurrent distressing dreams of the event. Psychological reactivity upon exposure to internal or external cues that symbolizes or resembles an aspect of the traumatic event, right? So part of the reason I'm asking these questions about what triggers is because we as staff, when we're working with our students, right, we need to be aware that, yes, there is a percentage, even though it's a small percentage, there is a percentage of our students who may have an element of PTSD or may be suffering from PTSD. And I'll tell you personally that it's typically amongst those students who got off of work on Friday with the military and they're starting school on Monday. But we get those individuals who come right into school, and what's interesting is they have not had a chance to go from that phase of military life right into civilian life. They just moved right into it as quickly as anything else they've done in the military. They're bringing with them, though, still responding and reacting to things that are around them. If they see something, they're going to react in a certain way. That's why some veterans, when they come home, they rack up speeding tickets, right? They're used to driving 60 to 80 miles an hour over there, and people move out of the way. Well, we Oregonians don't move out of the way, do we? You know, they don't like cars alongside the road. They get all the way over, and sometimes they're on the other side of the white line to get away from that car, you know. Little things like that. So for us, I think it's important to acknowledge that, yes, there is those individuals who have PTSD, and they're out there, and they may be suffering from it, and there may be triggers, right? And as we move through our jobs and as we move through things, what are some things that we can do to be sensitive to that? Because obviously we live in an environment where it's very challenging, because some of the things we do, we have to do, right? We have to do because it's part of our job. We have to have rules and regulations. We have to acknowledge other people's beliefs and standards and the rules and regulations that are around that. But how do we do that whenever we're helping student veterans? Although there are several different types of triggers, one of the things that I'm going to focus on today towards the last part of this presentation is the trigger of sight. Because part of the reason I'm bringing that up is because of you know, what we just recently saw with an art display here and how it kind of worked with some of our vets and some of them it didn't. And so I want to talk a little bit about how sight and vision and what people see may trigger something in somebody. And so what I have here is 3 pictures. When you see these pictures, how do they make you feel? Happy. It brings a feeling of happy because you can see that in it's just that cute little puppy. I will tell you that if my 9-year-old daughter was here this morning, one of these pictures would bring some very fond memories, but also one very sad memory. But this particular cat was a very close friend with my youngest daughter, who's 9 years old. And unfortunately, 1 year ago, and I get to remember this date quite vividly because I was here at commencement when I received a phone call. And it went something like this: "Pepper's dead, come home." I'm like, oh great, I'm in the middle of watching this commencement, doing some things, I just want to see this. All right, I guess I better go home. And once I get home, I come to find out that innocently a garage door had been brought down upon the cat and it passed away. So here it is almost a year later now, right? But for my youngest daughter, it's a very traumatic event for her because she was one of the first few who found the cat, right? This was her best buddy. This was her friend. And I know it's not the same when you're talking about humans, but when you look at the perspective of that individual and they're looking at this situation, even to this day, we have to go out and visit Pepper at the grave at least once a month or once every couple months because that's how attached she was. So when my daughter sees pictures like this, I try to make sure that she remembers the fond things. The fact that this cat was drawn to her and her only in the house and stayed away from everybody else for the first 6 months that it lived in our house. The fact that this cat actually chose us, we didn't choose it. The fact that this cat was the neighbor's cat, and when it finally did choose us, it didn't want anything to do with the neighbor anymore after they moved out. They tried to take it to their home, and it found its way back, even though it was, you know, several miles away where their new home was. Little things like that. And so pictures like this, I mean, they can spark some memories, some thoughts, that type of thing. So as you're working with student veterans, just keeping in mind how, again, environment can make a reaction in student veterans in general. You know, they see something and they go, hey, that's a memory that I don't necessarily want to remember. And it's challenging, right? Because we're not going to always know what the situation is. We're not going to always know, but it's working towards what's the best to where we can get things out there that educate folks, but you know, and there might be some things that might be touchy. Somebody might come along and see pictures like this, and they could have a memory like my daughter, right? But we do the best to try to help them navigate through that type of thing. And you would think that people like the VA, right, they would get this stuff right on. Now, the message that the picture was trying to send was military to education. Okay? But when I first looked at this picture, I'm like, I can already see people going, okay, well, all veterans must have been in combat, so that's why they're coming to school. But didn't I say earlier that's a myth? That's not the truth. That not all veterans go into combat, you know. But we associate M16 and helmet with combat, right? Because that's what we see all the time. I will tell you, when I was in the military, I was trained to fire, and I knew how to use. I wore a helmet. We all did. That was in the military at some point during our military career. But this is the VA, who is a subject matter expert in these things, and they didn't see how you putting a couple of things together could have a negative impact on what they were trying to do. What they were trying to do was encourage students that were veterans to get into education, right? There's some other pictures that probably would have been a little better job of doing that, right? I know many of you have probably seen the picture where you have a service member that's cut in half, and one half is somebody who's in uniform, one half is somebody in civilian clothes. I think that's a little better representation of service member to education, because again, now we're not moving to war or combat, we're actually moving to the individual, right? I think it's very clear, if you have a veteran who's just recently come off of military service, and if they're a National Guard or Reserve person, if they came off active duty, they just came off of deployment more likely than not, right? So their awareness is more heightened. And you get an individual, I don't care if they're doing a Nerf gun or if they're just trying to be silly and just jumping out from behind a bush, that's a pretty risky situation. So the idea, and he liked the fact that there was education that was done to folks to say, hey, look, maybe jumping out from behind bushes or sneaking up on people is not the best idea. Maybe you should stick to just those who are participating, that type of thing. Fortunately for us, we haven't had an incident, which I'm very happy about, but I have had some veterans who've told me, I've had to be kind of careful when that time happens. I try not to walk around bushes. I try not to walk around places where people can sneak up on me. My sense of awareness is heightened, so they're taking it upon themselves to kind of be aware that that's the time and what's things happening.
How do the military feel about civilians who wear camouflage and military gear?
Truthfully, we hate it. I personally will tell you that I had a struggle with it for the longest time, especially those individuals who are using the cutoff ones and whatnot, because it feels like you're degrading a military uniform. But after some years of just thinking through it and just thinking about the fact that, I said I would step up to the plate and fight for that person's right to have freedom of speech and freedom of how they believe, right? That's how they believe. I don't have to agree with it. I'm not going to choose to wear a uniform that way, but they can choose to wear it. I will tell you, most of the vets that I talk to, it's along the same lines as of burning the flag. Just not something they think's appropriate. They'll let it happen because it's their right, that individual person's right, but it's not something necessarily that they're going to go and support or say is right. Anything that goes to our military beliefs was very core value. Now, I will say this, a veteran will have no problem, especially our combat veterans, typically amongst the Marines, more in particular, or more of your special forces related veteran, that if you have an individual in the room who's talking about their supposed military status and some of the cool things that they did in combat and everything, and it's very clear that they haven't saw a day in their life in the military, or they were very minimal in the military, like basic training, then got kicked out kind of thing, they'll get called out. Our group does that. I have called some vets out. I would say I'm a little bit nicer about it than some of my friends that I've been around, but I have no problem with saying, that just doesn't sound right. Most people, as they get further and further away from their service, there's a maturity level that happens, there's a separation that happens, there's a loosening of things where they can go, okay, that's not a big deal to me, but this is. Like me, for instance, like I said, somebody wearing a uniform and stuff, I don't like it. I don't want you to wear it. I don't think it's appropriate. But where I can draw the line is okay, fine, you're wearing the uniform. Now, if you got all the medals, ribbons, and everything else, and you're impersonating an officer or a non-commissioned officer, I'm sorry, I have a problem with that, because that's inappropriate. Or if you're saying, I have a particular badge or medal that I happen to know people lose their life to get, I think I'm going to call you out on that. I mean, I won't be mean or rude about it, but I definitely will have a conversation with you. Yeah, I will say that I've talked to some veterans when it comes to school shootings or natural disasters, those will trigger them. And what's interesting is some of them rush in to serve. You know, it triggers them, but they rush in to serve because that's what they know to do. Where most people are running away from a situation sometimes, these are the type of people that are running into the situation, and you're asking, why would you run in that situation? It's only going to make your PTSD or your emotional situation worse. And when in reality, sometimes it doesn't make it worse, it actually heals some of that. I've seen some people who continue to serve today because that's their healing. That's how they can give back for the things that they felt that they took away. The question is, do I know the percentage of students here that are veterans? I don't have the percentage. What I can tell you is what our student veteran population is based upon our definition of student veterans. So we know that we have 860 students that are drawing a VA education benefit here on campus. And when I say here on campus, I mean eCampus, Corvallis campus, and Cascade campus all combined. Okay, we have about 400 ROTC cadets, and then there's an average of about 80 tuition assistance individuals that are active duty or National Guard reserves who are drawing some tuition assistance. What we don't know is the number of veterans that aren't drawing a VA benefit. We have no way to track them. I would tell you though that the average is that in every university and community college nationwide, the average is anywhere between 0.5 and 1% of whatever the school population is has a military tie in some manner. That's a pretty big percentage when you consider. Yeah. Yes, we have a lot of faculty here who are that are veterans or military related. In my role, not only do I help student veterans, but if a staff member was to come to me as a veteran and say, I need some assistance, I'm a Veterans Resource Coordinator. I have resources throughout the state of Oregon that I'm connected with. I would gladly help a staff member and have helped several staff members that are here that want to access their VA benefits or just talk about veterans issues in general. So, okay, that is it. You guys have a great day. Thank you.